EVO. The fire that consumed Borley Rectory on February 27, 1939, burned with an intensity that defied explanation. Flames leapt 60 feet into the Essex night, visible for miles across the flat countryside, consuming 76 years of accumulated mystery in a single night of supernatural fury. Fire Chief William Weber would later report that the blaze behaved unlike any house fire that he had encountered in 3 decades of service. The flames, they seemed to move with purpose, consuming some rooms completely while leaving others virtually untouched, as if the fire itself was making deliberate choices about what should survive and what should be reduced to ash. But what disturbed Weber most was what he heard in the roar of the flames. Voices, speaking words and languages he didn't recognize, crying out from rooms that had been empty for years. When his men reported similar experiences, Weber ordered them to retreat and just let the rectory burn. Some fires, he decided, were meant to consume more than just wood and stone. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, only the brick shell remained standing, a hollow monument to decades of documented supernatural activity that had made Borley Rectory famous as the most haunted house in England. But this story doesn't begin with fire in 1939. It actually begins 76 years earlier, when Reverend Henry Bull decided to build his dream home on ground that the church had abandoned 3 centuries before, on foundations that had witnessed centuries of human suffering, on soil that some believed had been cursed since the dissolution of the monasteries. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Rectory of the Damned. This is episode 1, The House That Hell Built. Now, if you're fascinated by stories where documented history meets supernatural mystery, where scientific investigation confronts ancient evil, then make sure you subscribe to The Devil Within wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave us a review. Help others discover these explorations of the places where the past refuses to stay buried, where the line between history and horror becomes impossibly thin. You could also check us out on YouTube. Today, we explore the most documented haunting in British history. 76 years of supernatural activity witnessed by clergy, by scientists, by journalists, and hundreds of visitors who came seeking explanations and left with questions that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Chapter 1 of our story begins now. The Convent's Shadow. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we, that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone, embrace, believing where we cannot prove. We're back to Alfred Lord Tennyson. He wrote those words in 1849, wrestling with faith and doubt in an age when science was beginning to challenge religious certainty. But he might have been describing the peculiar spiritual atmosphere that had surrounded the village of Borley, Essex, for nearly 8 centuries. A place where faith and doubt existed in this constant tension, where the visible and invisible worlds seemed permanently intertwined. The story of Borley Rectory begins not in 1863, when Reverend Henry Bull first broke ground for his new parsonage, but in 1362, when French Benedictine monks established a small priory on the same site. Now, the choice of location was significant. Borley sat on ancient ground, where Roman roads had once carried legions toward distant conquests, where Saxon settlements had risen and fallen, where the very soil held layers of human history stretching back to prehistory. The medieval priory of Borley was never a grand establishment. Historical records show it housed no more than a dozen monks at its peak, serving as more of a way station for pilgrims traveling between London and the Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham. But what the priory lacked in size, it made up for in the intensity of spiritual devotion. and spiritual conflict that would characterize the site for centuries to come. Brother Thomas de Bradenham, who served as prior from 1398 to 1419, left detailed chronicles that provide our earliest documented evidence of supernatural activities at Borley. His Latin manuscripts, preserved in the British Museum, describe phenomena that would become eerily familiar to future residents of the site. The sound of chanting when no services were being conducted, the appearance of hooded figures walking the grounds at night, and probably most disturbing of all, the persistent reports of a woman in white who appeared to be searching for something that she had lost. The priory's trouble intensified during the final decades before its dissolution. In 1534, just 4 years before Henry VIII's commissioners would seize the property, Prior William Melford wrote to his superiors describing, quote, manifestations of a most troubling nature that were disrupting the monastic life. Melford's letters, discovered in monastery archives much later in 1923, described monks who reported being awakened by the sound of a woman crying, of finding their cells rearranged during the night, and of seeing figures in lay clothing walking through walls that had been built centuries before their time. Most significant was Melford's account of a recurring apparition that would later become central to Borley's supernatural reputation. A young woman in a religious habit who appeared to be fleeing from unseen pursuers, her face marked by terror so profound that witnesses reported feeling overwhelming dread simply from observing her. According to Melford's records, this figure always followed the same path, emerging from what once had been the priory's chapel, crossing the grounds toward the woods, and then vanishing right near a well that had served the religious community since its founding. Local legend, preserved in village records dating to the 16th century, claimed that this apparition was the spirit of a French nun named Marie Lairre, who had attempted to elope with a lay brother from the monastery. According to the story, the couple had been discovered by the prior, and both had been executed as punishment for breaking their sacred vows. Marie strangled and buried in the monastery grounds, her lover beheaded, and his body thrown into that well. Now, whether this legend represents historical fact or medieval folklore remains disputed among scholars. What is documented, however, is that Henry VIII's commissioners found evidence of, quote, grave irregularities when they arrived to dissolve Borley Priory in 1538. Their official report, still housed in the Public Record Office, mentions the discovery of human remains during their systematic destruction of monastery buildings. Remains that included a female skeleton showing signs of traumatic, violent death. The dissolution of Borley Priory was particularly brutal, even by the standards of Henry VIII's campaign against English monasteries. Commissioner Thomas Leigh, who oversaw the destruction, reported that local workers refused to complete demolition, claiming again that supernatural activity intensified whenever they attempted to destroy certain buildings. Several workers fled the site entirely after reporting encounters with hostile apparitions, and Leigh was ultimately forced to bring in crews from distant counties just to finish the work. When the destruction was complete, the land was granted to Sir Edward Waldegrave, but the site remained largely unused for over 300 years. Local farmers avoided the area, and several attempts to build on the monastery foundations failed when construction workers reported being driven away by supernatural activity. And like a dying lady, lean and pale, who totters forth, wrapped in a gauzy veil. Tennyson's image of spectral femininity would prove prophetic for Borley, where the figure of a woman in distress would become the central mystery that connected medieval monastery to Victorian rectory to 20th century investigation. In 1862, exactly 324 years after the monastery's dissolution, the Church of England decided to establish a new parish in Borley Village. The commission to design and build the new rectory was given to Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, a man whose religious devotion was matched only by his fascination with history and architecture. Chapter 2. The Reverend's Vision. Come not when I am dead, to drop thy foolish tears upon my grave, to trample round my fallen head, and vex the unhappy dust thou wouldst not save. Tennyson got it. He understood something about the relationship between the living and the dead that Reverend Henry Bull would learn through 29 years of experience at Borley Rectory. And that is that some presences refuse to be laid to rest, that some grief is too profound to be contained by conventional boundaries between life and death. Henry Bull was a man of substantial faith and equally substantial ambition. Born in 1820 to a family of modest means, he had distinguished himself at Cambridge through academic excellence and unwavering devotion to Anglican theology. His vision for Borley Rectory extended far beyond the traditional duties of a parish priest. He intended to establish a center of learning that would demonstrate the superiority of Protestant scholarship over Catholic superstition. The rectory Bull designed was a monument to Victorian confidence in reason and progress. 23 rooms spread across 3 stories, with a library capable of housing thousands of theological volumes, a study equipped for serious academic work, and accommodations suitable for the stream of visiting scholars that Bull hoped to attract. The building's red brick construction and Gothic Revival architecture were intended to project permanence and authority. But from the moment the Bull family moved into their new home in October of 1863, it became clear that the rectory's previous inhabitants had not been displaced as thoroughly as Henry Bull had anticipated. Construction had begun in spring of 1863, and from the very beginning, workers reported unusual experiences. The site foreman, Thomas Wright, kept a diary that documents incidents that would have discouraged less determined men. One entry reads, June 15, 1863. Found all our tools arranged in a perfect circle this morning. Men are getting nervous. Johnson swears he saw a lady in white standing where the old altar would have been. Another reads, July 2nd, 1863. The strangest thing today. We were laying foundation stones when we heard what sounded like a funeral service being conducted underground. Clear as day. Latin words, responses, the whole thing. But when we stopped work to listen, it ceased immediately. The first documented supernatural incident occurred on November 12, 1863, exactly 1 month after the family's arrival. Caroline Bull was supervising the hanging of curtains when she observed a woman in dark clothing walking slowly across the lawn. Assuming the figure was a parishioner seeking assistance, Caroline called out through the window. The woman turned toward the house, and Caroline found herself looking at a face marked by such profound sorrow that she was momentarily unable to speak. When Caroline recovered, she went outside, and she found the lawn empty. A thorough search revealed no trace of the woman. Henry Bull initially attributed his wife's experience just to moving stress. But Caroline's sighting established a pattern that would persist throughout the Bull family's tenure. The appearance of a woman in dark clothing who seemed to be searching for something or someone that she would never find. As winter settled over Essex, the supernatural activity intensified. The Bull children began reporting encounters that their parents initially dismissed as childhood imagination. But young Emily claimed to see, quote, the sad lady walking in the garden at dusk. 7-year-old Walter reported hearing footsteps in corridors when the family was gathered elsewhere. Most unsettling were the accounts of 10-year-old Henry Jr., who would later inherit both the rectory and its supernatural legacy. Harry Jr. displayed unusual sensitivity to supernatural activity from his earliest days at Borley. His detailed diary, begun at age 11, provides compelling contemporary evidence of paranormal phenomena. He wrote, December 15, 1863, saw the lady again today near the old well. She was wearing a brown dress and seemed to be looking for something. When I called to her, she turned, and I could see she was crying. But then Father called me for lessons, and when I looked back, she was gone. Or January 8th, 1864. The footsteps came again last night. They start at the end of the corridor and walk toward the stairs, but they never reach them. Always the same number of steps, always stopping at the same place. His dad's response evolved from skeptical dismissal to grudging acknowledgement as the evidence accumulated. A methodical man trained in theological scholarship, Henry Bull began keeping his own record of supernatural incidents. He wrote, March 10th, 1864, Caroline insists she heard organ music coming from the direction of the old chapel site. I heard nothing myself, but found her in considerable distress, and the children support her account. And May 30th, 1864, I must acknowledge that we are sharing this house with presences that I cannot explain through conventional theology. Whatever dwells here seems intent on making its existence known, but shows no apparent hostility toward our family. As the Bull family adapted to life at Borley Rectory, they developed what could only be described as a working relationship with their supernatural housemates. The phenomena followed predictable patterns. Most significantly, the family established what they came to call, quote, the nun's walk, which is just a path across the rectory grounds that the spectral figure followed with such regularity that the family could set their clocks by her appearances. The nun's walk became something of a local attraction during their years there. Henry Bull, recognizing the evangelistic potential of documented supernatural activity, he began inviting visitors to observe the phenomenon. The guest book at Borley Rectory contains entries from clergy, from academics, and curious members of the public who came to witness what many considered the most reliable ghost sighting in England. Dr. Edward Mason, professor of theology at Oxford University, visited Borley in June of 1871. I came to Borley as a skeptic, prepared to expose what I assumed was either deliberate fraud or unconscious self-deception. Instead, I found myself confronting phenomena that challenged my understanding of the natural order. At precisely 5:30 p.m., a female figure in religious habit appeared near the ruins of the old chapel and proceeded to walk a specific route across the rectory grounds. I observed this manifestation on 3 consecutive evenings, each time identical in timing and appearance. By the 1870s, Borley Rectory had achieved a unique status in Victorian society. A respectable, clerical household where supernatural activity was not only acknowledged, but documented with scholarly precision. Chapter 3. Inheritance of Darkness. Be near me when my light is low, when the blood creeps and the nerves prick and tingle, and the heart is sick and all the wheels of being slow. So when Henry Bull Jr. inherited Borley Rectory in 1892 following the death of his father, he also inherited 29 years of accumulated supernatural history. At age 39, Henry Jr. was uniquely prepared for his role as custodian of England's most documented haunting. He'd grown up observing the nun's walk as routine. He'd learned to navigate around predictable patterns of spectral activity. He had developed what amounted to scholarly expertise in the supernatural ecology of his family home. But inheritance brought responsibilities that observation had not prepared him for. As the new rector, Harry Jr. was expected to provide spiritual guidance to parishioners who had their own complicated relationship with the rectory's supernatural reputation. More challenging still was his growing recognition that the phenomena at Borley Rectory were evolving. Now, the changes began subtly. The nun's walk, which had maintained the same route and timing for nearly 30 years, started to vary. Sometimes the spectral figure would appear earlier or later than expected. Sometimes she would deviate from her established path, approaching closer to the rectory itself, even appearing to peer through windows as if searching for something inside the building. Harry Jr.'s diary documents these evolving patterns with methodical attention. October 15th, 1892. The lady appeared at 5:45 today, 15 minutes later than usual. More significantly, she approached within 10 feet of the drawing room window and seemed to be studying the interior of the house. When I opened the window to speak to her, she turned away, but not before I observed her face clearly for the first time. She appears to be quite young, perhaps no more than 20, with features marked by what I can only describe as desperate urgency. And this entry, from November 8, 1892. A most unusual occurrence. The lady appeared not in the garden, but inside the house, standing in the corridor outside the library. She remained visible for nearly 5 minutes, long enough for me to observe that her religious habit is of a style I do not recognize, certainly not contemporary Anglican dress. As Harry Jr. struggled to understand the evolving nature of Borley's supernatural activity, he also faced practical challenges that his father had just never encountered. The rectory's reputation was beginning to affect his ministerial duties in ways that ranged from amusing to deeply troubling. Young couples requested their wedding ceremonies be conducted at Borley specifically because they hoped the presence of spirits would bless their union. Conversely, some parishioners refused to attend evening services. Most problematic were the increasing numbers of curiosity seekers who came to Borley not for spiritual guidance, but for supernatural entertainment. By the mid-1890s, Harry Jr. had developed a theory about the supernatural activity at Borley that would influence paranormal investigators for generations to come. Based on his careful observations and study of the site's medieval history, he concluded that the apparitions weren't random hauntings, but specific spiritual manifestations connected to unresolved trauma from the monastery period. His hypothesis proposed that the woman in white was indeed the spirit of a medieval nun whose violent death had created a spiritual disturbance that persisted across centuries. According to Harry Jr.'s theory, the nun's repetitive appearances and searching behavior suggested that she was trapped in a state of unresolved purpose, unable to rest until some earthly justice was acknowledged or corrected. Among those who corresponded with Harry Jr. was Dr. Frederick Myers, one of the founders of the Society for Physical Research. Myers visited Borley in 1897 and spent a week observing the supernatural activity. His report provided the first formal scientific documentation of the Borley phenomena. He wrote, "The manifestations at Borley Rectory represent the most consistent and well-documented case of apparitional activity in our records. The figure observed by myself and multiple witnesses displays characteristics that cannot be explained through conventional psychological or physical theories. Most significantly," he continued, "the apparition demonstrates awareness of observers and responds to environmental changes in ways that suggest genuine consciousness rather than mere psychic recording of past events." As the 19th century drew to a close, Henry Bull Jr. had established Borley Rectory as more than just a haunted house. It had become a laboratory for the emerging field of paranormal research. But the new century would bring challenges that would test not only Harry Jr.'s theories about supernatural manifestations, but his faith in the possibility of providing spiritual assistance to entities trapped between worlds. That which we dare invoke to bless our dearest faith, our ghastliest doubt. Tennyson's meditation on the mysterious nature of divine power would prove prophetic for Harry Bull Jr. as he entered the 20th century. The forces he had studied with scholarly detachment for over 30 years were about to reveal aspects of their nature that would challenge not only his understanding of the supernatural, but his faith in the protective power of Christian ministry itself. Alfred Lord Tennyson spent much of his poetic career wrestling with the tension between faith and doubt, between the world as we wish it to be and the world as we observe it to exist. The Bull family's 76-year tenure at Borley Rectory represents a similar struggle. The attempt to maintain rational Christian faith in the face of phenomena that challenged every assumption about the relationship between the living and the dead. What makes Borley Rectory unique among documented hauntings is not just the consistency of supernatural activity across multiple generations, but the methodical approach that the Bull family brought to understanding their spectral housemates. They treated the supernatural not as an intrusion to be eliminated, but as a mystery to be studied, to be documented, and ultimately comprehended within a larger theological framework. The woman in white or brown or in the habit who walked the grounds of Borley Rectory over 7 decades was more than just a ghost. She was a living symbol of unresolved trauma, of justice delayed, of the terrible persistence of suffering across centuries. The Bull family's documented observations provide us with something unprecedented in paranormal literature: a detailed portrait of how supernatural manifestations evolve over time, how they respond to changes in their environment, how they adapt their behavior in response to human attention. But the Bull family era at Borley was drawing to a close. In 1927, Harry Bull Jr. would die suddenly, and the rectory would pass into the hands of new residents who lacked the Bulls' generational experience in managing supernatural phenomena. The Foister family had no idea what they were inheriting when they moved to Borley in 1930. They viewed the rectory's supernatural reputation as, quaint local folklore. They were catastrophically wrong. Next time on the Rectory of the Damned, the 5 years that nearly destroyed everyone who lived at Borley, when the Gentle Nun's Walk became a poltergeist rampage, and when investigators realized that some supernatural activity grows stronger when challenged, rather than weaker. Until next time, thanks for listening to The Devil Within, and stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.